John and Jane were always on the lookout for their next big thrill. They had tried every drug they could get their hands on, but nothing seemed to satisfy their craving for something more. That was, until they heard about DMT. According to rumor, DMT was a powerful hallucinogen that could transport users to other dimensions and allow them to communicate with beings from other worlds. The thought of it was tantalizing to John and Jane, who were always searching for ways to escape the monotony of their mundane lives. After weeks of searching, they finally found a dealer who was willing to sell them a batch of the mysterious substance. Excited to see what it could do, John and Jane decided to take it together on a warm summer evening. As they lay on their bed, they each inhaled a hit of DMT and waited for the effects to kick in. At first, everything seemed normal. But then, they began to feel a strange tingling sensation in their limbs, and the room around them seemed to warp and twist. Suddenly, they found themselves in a twisted, hellish landscape filled with demonic creatures. One of these creatures approached them, introducing itself as a machine elf. But there was something off about this machine elf. It seemed to radiate an aura of pure evil, and its words were filled with malice and deceit. The machine elf told John and Jane a story about the true nature of the universe, painting a picture of a dark and malevolent place ruled by powerful forces of darkness. It claimed that reality itself was just a veil, and that behind it lay a realm of unspeakable horrors waiting to be unleashed. As the machine elf spoke, John and Jane felt a creeping sense of dread wash over them. They knew that they had to escape this twisted dimension, but they had no idea how. They tried to run, but the landscape seemed to shift and change around them, trapping them in a never-ending nightmare. Just when they thought all hope was lost, they were confronted by a group of beings who introduced themselves as jinns. The jinns told John and Jane that they were powerful entities from another realm, and that they had the power to grant them their deepest desires. But there was a catch. In order to receive their wishes, John and Jane would have to pledge their loyalty to the jinns and worship them as their gods. Faced with the prospect of gaining their heart's desires or facing an eternity of torment, John and Jane hesitated. In the end, they made the decision to pledge their loyalty to the jinns, hoping that their wishes would be granted and that they would finally find the escape they had been seeking. But as they recited the oath of loyalty, they knew deep down that they had made a terrible mistake. They knew that they had traded their freedom for a life of servitude and despair. As the jinns vanished in a puff of smoke, John and Jane knew that they were doomed to spend the rest of their days in the twisted realm of DMT, worshipping their new masters and living out their darkest nightmares. But little did they know, the jinns had their own agenda. They had no intention of granting John and Jane's wishes, and they had only used the couple as pawns in their own twisted game. For years, John and Jane were forced to worship the jinns and do their bidding, living out their days in a never-ending cycle of servitude and despair. They were barely able to survive in the harsh, twisted landscape of the DMT realm, and they longed for the freedom and happiness they had once known. But their dreams of escape were shattered when the jinns revealed their true intentions. It turned out that they had been using John and Jane all along, manipulating them in order to further their own nefarious plans. The jinns were power-hungry beings who wanted nothing more than to rule over the universe and bend all of reality to their will. And they had been using John and Jane as pawns in their grand scheme to achieve their goals. Enraged and heartbroken, John and Jane knew that they had been tricked and used. They had sacrificed everything for the chance to escape their mundane lives, only to be trapped in a never-ending cycle of servitude and despair. But they refused to give up. Despite their worn and broken bodies, they knew that they had to find a way to escape the clutches of the jinns and take back control of their own lives. And so, they began to plot and scheme, seeking out allies and forming a rebellion against the jinns. They knew that it would be a difficult and dangerous task, but they were determined to fight for their freedom and make a stand against their tyrannical overlords. As the rebellion grew, John and Jane became the leaders of a movement that spread across the DMT realm. They inspired others who had been trapped and used by the jinns, giving them hope and a sense of purpose. Together, they fought bravely against the jinns and their forces, using every trick and tactic at their disposal. But despite their valiant efforts, the jinns proved to be formidable opponents. They had immense powers and were nearly impossible to defeat. And as the rebellion raged on, John and Jane began to doubt if they would ever be able to win. But they refused to give up. They knew that they had to keep fighting, no matter how hopeless it seemed. And as the years passed, they remained determined and resolute, never letting their spirits be broken by the jinn's tyranny. But in the end, their efforts were in vain. The jinns proved to be too powerful, and John and Jane's rebellion was crushed. They were captured and punished for their rebellion, and they were forced to spend the rest of their lives in a dark and miserable cell, separated from the rest of the world and forgotten by all. As they lay in their cell, John and Jane knew that they had failed. They had lost everything in their pursuit of freedom, and they were doomed to spend the rest of their days in misery and despair. They knew that they had made a terrible mistake, and that they would pay for it for the rest of their lives. And as the years went by, John and Jane's once youthful bodies began to wither and age. They were barely able to survive in the harsh, twisted landscape of the DMT realm, and they longed for the freedom and happiness they had once known. But their dreams of escape were shattered forever, and they were left to rot in their cell, forgotten and alone. The jinns had won, and John and Jane had lost everything in their pursuit of something more. They had traded their happiness and freedom for a life of servitude and misery, and they knew that they would never be able to escape the darkness that had consumed them.